warming up. Let me.
Hi. Hi, let's see. This doesn't sound on.
I hear it.
Is it? It is? Okay, cool. Perfect then. So I'm not actually starting yet because we are seeing if there's technical help so that you can actually see this book that I'm going to be reading from. So since I'm not starting yet, officially, I'm going to start at the back because why not start at the end so you guys can look at something. So I will tell you while you're waiting that this is a book and this is a story about my mom who survived the Holocaust with her family that had to come over from Europe together, right? And the story that I tell is in the first person. It's her story. So it says, I did this, I did that.
Did she write the book?
I wrote the book. But
You're an author.
I am. Yeah, so this person here, that's me.
What's your name?
Michelle is on. Okay? But this person here is my mom.
75.
This was my mother. My mother was a teenager during the Holocaust. I'll show you. So that's why I was going to start at the back. So this one, that's me. That's my mother.
What's the mother?
Well, we'll get to that. This is that's my older brother. One of my two brothers. These are that's my older brother, my middle brother, and my mom.
Yeah, that is not.
You're a good writer.
That is not it.
That's me. I was a light baby.
Where's your mom?
That's my mom. This is my mother and my father.
They said here?
Yep. That's me. Yep. That's my mother. I know. Yeah.
How old are you? No, she isn't.
How old am I now or how old was I then?
How old are you then?
65. Old. Old.
What other girls are on?
Curious
What other girls are?
Yeah, they don't. I know, right?
Let me show you some more pictures. I did not draw the pictures because I cannot draw anything. But this was my mother not too long after she came over to America.
What else? Who else?
And this was her brother, her younger brother.
Yeah. Oh, no. Oh, no. I just know.
This person is the reason that my parents, my mom got to come because she was already here in America.
No, that's. I use mine.
She made it right for my mom and her parents to come because you had to have someone here to
Who else?
and or somebody.
Lucy.
So
That's
that's
how it works.
that's how it works.
What's her
That's how
Where was she?
Yeah, there's some issues. Okay.
This was
It's not us. There's some.
this was
Yeah, there's some problem with this.
Is Adam here?
No, I don't know if Adam's here. I don't know if Adam's here. I don't think. Let's not worry about it.
Here's some pictures. This is my mom. After she came to this country.
Okay, guys, let's everyone find their seats. You guys have already met. So this is Miss Michelle Bisson. Miss Bisson is a writer and a playwright. And her mother was a Holocaust survivor, and she's going to tell us a little bit about her mother's story in honor of Yom HaShoah, which is today. So she'll talk for the next about 45 minutes. There'll be time for questions, hopefully, at the end, and I'm sure it'll be very interesting. So,
All right, thank you.
everyone, please give her your closest and most respectful attention. Okay?
Hi. So, I'm glad everybody's here. It's nice to see everybody. Today I'm going to be reading, as I told you a little bit, my mother's story. It's called Hedy's Journey, and I'll try to make some time to come down so you can see this a little closer. But my mom's name was Hedy, and my mother was a teenager during World War II. Do people know anything about, before I start, have people heard about World War II? Yes? Tell me, you raised your hand first. What's your name? Caleb, tell me, what do you know about World War II? What happened then? You know a lot. Okay, so you know everything. Okay, so we don't need to probably know everything, but do you know, can you tell people briefly why there was a war? What happened that caused the war?
So there was a Great Depression,
Mm-hmm.
and it was not only in America, it was, I'm pretty sure it was all around the world.
That's
The
right.
stock market crashed. That's what started it. Then the Germans, Hitler blamed it on the Jews. And then there was a lot of falsehoods around the world, accusing Jews of this and that. And then eventually the Nazi party came to power in Germany, and then, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good summation. Thank you.
That's just a short.
That's a short, but, and not sweet, because it's not a sweet story, but it's a short but correct version of what happened. So this happened in, across the ocean in Europe. Do people know where Europe is? It was an economic depression, which meant that people didn't have money. So people lost jobs, people couldn't buy things. So say the price of eggs might normally be $3 and suddenly it might be $30. And how were people going to buy that or pay for that when they had no jobs? Or if they had a job, maybe they weren't making much money. So it was a bad situation, and in a bad situation, often people want to blame somebody. And Hitler, as Caleb said, came to power and said, aha, I know what, we're going to blame the Jews. And the thing about Jewish people in Europe is that Jewish people lived in every country in Europe. They lived in America, they lived in Asia, they lived in Africa. There are Jewish people everywhere. And Jewish people were German too. Hitler was German, Austrian, and he said these are separate people. These aren't really good Germans. These aren't Germans. These are people who we can blame. They are bad. He didn't like a lot of people. He didn't like Catholic people. He didn't like what were called then Gypsy Roma. All kinds of people who weren't what he thought they should be. So he said, well, let's get rid of those people. And it wasn't just Germany, though. He went, does anybody have relatives from Europe? Where are they from?
So I had family actually, like in Russia, Germany, on my mom and dad's side, but on my dad's side.
Mm-hmm.
So his mom, her family was from the
Was in the Holocaust?
Yes, and they were, my mom's family, his mom's family were alive while
Uh-huh.
World War II, and most of them, some of his family, my family were killed, but also some of them fled the country.
Right, and that happened with a lot of families. How about yours? You?
A bunch of my family was from Poland.
Mm-hmm. And Poland was the first place that they invaded,
Yeah.
actually, yeah. Yes?
Some of my family was from, some of it was from Israel. Some of my family, I think my dad's dad was from Siberia.
Okay. And Siberia, for those who don't know, is in Russia, right? Cal?
No, maybe some of it from
From England. Some of my family was from England too.
Yeah, my grandpa's from Pelham.
Okay, and you?
My entire dad's side of the family is from Israel.
Okay.
And my parents.
So, all right. So my mother's family was from Hungary. My mother was born in Hungary. Has anybody ever heard of Hungary, the country? Yes. Okay. So one of the interesting things about Hungary is that, so we know Poland was the first place that was invaded, Czechoslovakia. Gradually, many countries in Europe were invaded. Hungary wasn't. Hungary had its own, so in German, the anti-Semites, people know what anti-Semitism means?
Yes.
What does it mean? Tell people. Can you tell me what you think it means?
Anti means, I guess, reverse of, like,
For,
pro.
right?
Semitism is more of,
So who were the Semites? Does anybody know? You probably know, Cal. Yes, so they were against the Jews. That's right. So and they formed a party called the Nazi Party. So in Hungary there was a Nazi party too, so Germany didn't need to invade right away. Hungary was the last country that was invaded in World War II. They had their own Nazis. So when I was in 6th grade, so I was older than you guys, when I was in 6th grade, I went to school and my teacher told us about this thing called the Holocaust. And the Holocaust was where, during World War II, when many, many Jews were killed. She didn't tell us that many Jews survived, though they went through horrors. Many of them had to hide, they had to flee, they had to pretend they were not Jewish. I didn't know any of that. So, and I didn't know anything about this thing called the Holocaust. So I came home and I said, Mom, what is this thing called the Holocaust? Did that happen? And she said, yeah, it happened. And I thought, well, I'm 11, I know nothing about this. And so she slowly told me the story of what happened. She didn't tell me all at once. But I learned that my mom and her little brother, Robert, he was 11, she was 16, and her parents all lived in Hungary, and they all escaped Hungary and came to America together. But it wasn't a given. It wasn't like, oh, this could happen. And in Hungary, many people didn't leave because, as I said, Germany hadn't invaded. In much of Europe, they were putting them in what were called concentration camps, so these really terrible places where they made Jews work like enslaved people. They were enslaved, starved them, many people died, but that hadn't happened yet in Hungary. But what did happen was that my mother had a cousin Marika, and cousin Marika was a little bit older than my mom. She was 18, and she was staying with them because she was learning a trade to work. And in September of 1941, the Hungarians got really in tandem with the Germans. They said, well, you know what? We got to get rid of anybody who's not Hungarian. We don't want them here. So my mother's cousin Marika was deported. But people know what that means? Deported? Yeah.
Basically, taken away.
Yes. They had to leave. So they weren't taken away exactly in the way that they were in Germany, but they said, you have to leave. If not, we'll take you. That's exactly right. If not, we'll take you. So when that happened, the war had been going on for 2 years, so many Jews knew that people from their families were disappearing and that bad things were happening. And so they begged my cousin to stay. It really was my mother's, because they begged her to stay. Please stay. And she said, no, I need to be with my family. And she said, and this was just so touching, she said, I'm only sorry I didn't get more out of life while I could. And that's because she knew what was happening to the Jewish people. And this was a wake-up call, as we call it now, for my mother's family and for many Hungarians when this happened, because my mother's family wasn't the only family that had relatives there from another country, and they realized, they're like, oh no, if they're going to come for one Jew, they're going to come for us all. And they realized it's time to leave. And it wasn't so easy to leave, though. So it's not like, now you could just get up and say, I don't like this country. Well, even now, it's not so easy. There are a couple things you need. And does anybody know what you need to leave a country? What? You do need a visa. Very good. And you also need a passport. And how do you get a visa or a passport?
Passport, you go through a long time of all these checks and this and that. And then eventually at the very end, you have to get your picture taken.
Yes, that is true.
I would consider the most miserable part.
Well, it may be. It may be the most miserable part. But what's harder, a passport or a visa? Does anybody know? Oh,
What's a visa?
maybe not.
It's a visa because you need to go to Turkey to get a visa.
Well, it is really hard to get a visa, and the reason is because with a passport, you can pretty much go anywhere, but with a visa, you get, for certain countries, restrict the number of people who can come in, or for reasons you can come in. And so there were restrictions, like now in this country, there are restrictions on immigrants. Only so many immigrants can come in. Well, it was the same in World War II, only more so. And so if you were Jewish, or a lot of other things, but especially if you were Jewish, the number of visas was very limited. And this was already, as I said, a couple years into the war, they were more and more limited. So there was only 2 ways you could get a visa. Anybody have the slightest idea what that is? Probably not, right? I wouldn't have known either at your age. One, you had to have a relative who could speak for you, a relative who was already in the country. And why that was is so you weren't just wandering around in the United States. You had somebody who would speak for you. And the other thing you were going to need is money. Not for the visa itself, but because they weren't going to give a visa to somebody who had no means of support. So my parents were very lucky because they had my mother's mother. This is my mother's mother. So she had a sister who had come to America in the 1930s just because she wanted to. And the sister said, okay, sure, you can come and stay with me. And one reason the sister said you can come is because my grandfather was a diamond jeweler. So she thought, cool, he'll come and he'll bring some money and and some jewels. And what nobody here in America realized is that it was unlikely that you would get out with much money. They restricted what you could take, and there would be expenses along the way. But nevertheless, my parents were very lucky. They got the visa. They were among the last people in the Second World War to get a visa. But then back to this passport. So the way passports worked then is that the children, if you were a child, you were on your parents' passport. And so my uncle, who was 11, he was on his mother's passport. But my mom was just old enough, she wasn't. She was on a separate passport. And so when they left, what happened was everybody was in Hungary was like, uh-oh, got to get out of here, the people who could. And so it was very hard to get passage out. And so they could only get passage for my grandfather, my grandmother, and my uncle, because he was on the grandmother's passport. So my mom had to go by herself, and she had to go after. So she had to stay all by herself. So imagine being a little older than you and be like, oh, well, tough. You'll get on a train. And the train went through where? The train went through Germany. And what was happening in Germany in 1941? Nothing good. Nothing good. There was a war going on. So she had to go by herself on a train and then a plane. And in those days, passenger planes were these tiny little things, more like helicopters almost than real planes now. And she had never been out of the country, and she'd never been on a plane, and she'd certainly never been on a plane in the middle of a war. So how that worked is that there were people to help. So, well, first, her aunt brought her to the train station, and there were guards, and they were Nazis. So how did she get through? because people were identified as Jews. How did she get through? Any guesses?
Did she claim that she was German?
Well, you're close. What do you think?
Fake ID.
Also close, but this was Hungary. This was not Germany, so Jews were still allowed to leave, maybe. But what it really was,
Carry the book around while you talk.
yeah, sure. What it really was that she didn't look Jewish. And what is someone who looked Jewish? What do you think they said? What they look like?
I think they would have like the curls.
The side curls? Men would. Men would. So she was a girl, so girls didn't have side curls, but they were considered, they would have very dark hair, they might have a big nose, they might also, like a long nose. Now, everybody looks different who's Jewish, just like everybody who looks different who's not. But the red hair, they thought, oh, she's not Jewish, and they let her through.
Oh, they thought she was Irish.
Yes, which is crazy, because what would an Irish person be doing in Hungary, but who cares, right? Because she, that way she got through. So she's really terrified on the train because they would come through looking for papers. But an older woman kind of was nice to her, and she talked to her, and she thought about how cool it was going to be to go to America, because she really wanted to go to America. She had learned English in school, so she knew some English. And people everywhere thought of America as the land of the free, the home of the brave, this best place to be. And she wanted to go there because even in Hungary, before the war, there was prejudice against the Jews. And Jews were segregated. They couldn't go to the same schools as other people. If you flip the page, you'll see they weren't allowed to use the same pool, the city pool, as other Hungarians. They were restricted. No Jews allowed. So my mom would snuck in one night with a friend. She was like, hey, she had a sense of justice. She thought, this is not so good. And so she thought about that, and that kind of kept her calm. And then when the train came in, it came into Vienna in Austria, she was met, you can flip the page again, by a young man who was not Jewish. So have you guys, do you know about the Underground Railroad in this country? Yeah. So during the Second World War, for people who were Jewish, there were people we would now call upstanders, allies, helpers, people who were not for the Germans, who helped people who were Jewish. And so it was like that kind of way of an underground railroad. And this young man helped her. He took her to her hotel. And then he said, it was 3 p.m, do you want to go out? And my mom's been stuck on this train. She's been terrified. She's been miserable. She's been scared. She's like, great, that would be wonderful. So they go, and you can flip the page again, I think, to this wonderful alpine, sort of like a ski lift. And they go, and the air is fresh, and it's wonderful. And then what? And then there are German soldiers, because they're in Austria, in Germany. And they're singing the Nazi stormtrooper song, which is all about how basically you're going to kill the Jews and, have only Germans. So my poor mom, she's halfway there. She's feeling good until this happens. And that was it for her. She's just like, take me back, because she's terrified, as one would be, because you would be scared if you were in a country where they did nasty, terrible things to you, and many people died. And so the young man took her back to her hotel, and she basically had a little food with her, and she stayed there till the morning, and it was time to take her. And then she took a flight. It was her first flight. So it was this combination of things, of like horrible, fun, in a way, unlucky, lucky, and it was her first time on a plane. And so that was really, exciting for her, and she made it to the plane. And so she was almost halfway there. And the plane took her to Portugal, which is where her mom and dad and her brother already were, because Portugal was one of the few safe places that you could be during World War II at that time. And never had she been so happy to see her family, probably, and they, her, I think you can flip the page again. Her dad, I knew her dad. That was my grandfather, and I knew him till I was 11, and he was not a man who hugged or kissed a lot. He was not a demonstrative man, if you know that term, but he hugged his daughter then, right? He was, excited to see her. One of the things that happened, and they were all together again, is when my grandparents they did the same trip as my mom, so before they got to Portugal, they were in Vienna, and they didn't have somebody to help them. They apparently thought adults could manage on their own, so they didn't have a set place to go, so they had to find a hotel in Vienna, and every hotel they passed said no Jews allowed. Just like in this country, in the South and parts of the North, they would say no blacks allowed. And for that matter, when I was a little kid, there were places that still said no Jews allowed or no Jews could work here. And every hotel was lit up and said no Jews, no Jews, no Jews. And finally they found one with no sign. And so they went in, and they were able, that's not in the book, that's just me, and they were able to go in, and they had a good night's sleep, and the next morning they left, and guess what? The sign just wasn't lit up. So they had survived a night in a no Jews allowed, and nobody really knew what's a Jew, like we said, what does a Jew look like? Nobody really knows. They don't know. They don't, they thought Jews had horns. Well, they didn't have horns, right? Or Jews were all religious with side curls. Well, they weren't so religious because there are just as many kinds of Jews as there is everybody else. So anyway, they met up. They're set to go, so they were going to go on a ship. That's how you went mostly in those days. You went on a ship from Portugal to the United States. And they're all set to go. They had their passage. They had their tickets. And then it was December 7th, 1941. Anybody know what that was? No. What happened then? Nobody knows what happened December 7th?
We talked about it, Caleb, in our group today.
Do you know?
Wasn't that when the Nazis started torturing the Jews?
December 7th, 1941 was when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, actually. So they bombed Pearl Harbor, and as a result, the United States went into the war. And who bombed them? It wasn't the Germans, it was the Japanese. The Japanese and Germans were in the war together against England, France, the U.S. Sorry? Yeah. So we went into the war, and what did that mean? It meant that American ship that was going to take my mom and her brother and her parents was not going to take them. How come? Because that ship was needed for the war, for America being in the war. So they're stuck in Portugal. All right, so they're stuck in Portugal. There are worse things. They could be still in Hungary, although nothing bad had happened really yet in Hungary. So still, they're like, well, we're halfway there, and so they got passage on another ship, they thought. And they got passage on another ship. They're excited to go. Everything's great. And then they go to the travel agent to pick up their tickets, and guess what? No tickets. What happened? What happened was the travel agency, they spent the money. They said, oh, we invested it in something bad. And it went bad. It's like, So there are bad people and good people everywhere, right? People who helped them, people who didn't. But like I said to begin with, my grandfather was a diamond jeweler, and they had some jewelry. And some of that jewelry was my mom's, and they bribed them. Basically, actually, they bribed the officials so that they could get booked on a third ship. But my grandfather thought, what if something happens here? Let's go back. Let's just go back. Now, my grandfather was not that much younger then than I am now, and he'd lived his whole life in Hungary, in Budapest. He loved it. His family was still there because many people could not just leave. So a lot of people were still there. He wanted to go home. And, and it didn't seem like such a terrible idea. In a way, they had no money, they had no jobs, they might be stuck in Portugal. But my grandmother and my mother said no, because what was happening in Hungary too was when Jews left, often the people, they left all their stuff behind, and other people would take their stuff or take their apartments, take their jobs, take their businesses. So they said, no, we're going to go. And mercifully, luckily, they were so lucky, the third ship went. But the third ship had 1,000 people in it. It was a ship built for 500 people. But since everybody was trying to leave, and that also meant it was money for the ship, there were 1,000 people on a ship meant for 500 people. And my mother did not have a good time on the ship. She was seasick. Anybody ever been seasick? Yeah. Yeah.
The ocean has seen my worst.
So imagine being seasick for weeks and weeks. And she said the lines for the toilets were forever. And it was not a good experience at all. And then it got worse because the ship, again, was meant for 500 people, 1,000 people. It ran out of coal. It just ran out of fuel. So they got stuck in Bermuda. And does anybody know where Bermuda is?
You're going to die.
That's where everything
Getting stuck
goes
in the Bermuda Triangle is the worst place ever.
But they weren't in the triangle, you're right. They were near the country, but you would be right. So Bermuda is actually a very pretty country, very beautiful country. But they couldn't get out of the boat. Do you know why they couldn't get out of the boat?
Was there no, lifeboats or lifeguards?
No, that's not why. That's not why. Do you know why?
There are too many people.
There are a lot of people, but
Was it that they didn't want Jews to, be in their country?
that wasn't it either. It's a really, so let me ask you this. So let's say you're coming from, this happened to me. You're coming from England back home to New York, and something's wrong with the plane, for example, and it has to make a stop, a first land stop. And in my case, it landed in Canada. And why couldn't we get off? Do you know? That's right, because you'd have to go through customs, and that's a whole bureaucratic process. And they weren't allowed to do that, so they had to stay on the boat. But it wasn't so bad, because at least it was pretty. They sailed around. And eventually, Bermuda they said, first, we don't have any coal, but I don't think Bermuda wanted 1,000 people in their water forever. And eventually, you're right, they'd die, not because of the Bermuda Triangle, but because they'd run out of food, of coal, any number, they'd get cold. So they gave them just enough coal to get to Virginia, Newport News, Virginia, in this country. But there were 1,000 people on the ship, and only 100 of those people had visas to get into the United States, because one, like I said, was they weren't giving many visas. It was difficult to get a visa. You had to have money. South America was much nicer. They had fewer people. They could use more people. Cuba was happy to take anybody Jewish. And Chile also took them, but this boat was supposed to, so what was supposed to happen, again, because of the customs, all those 900 people, they couldn't come into America because they weren't being allowed in. So they were supposed to go to Cuba first. They docked in Newport News, Virginia. They were supposed to get coal, spend another couple of weeks going down to Cuba, and then come back to America, to New York, to Ellis Island. And the people on the boat who could go to America said, wait a minute, maybe let's ask President Roosevelt if we can come in. And so they cabled President Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was the president then, and said, Ken, we were here. Could we come in and take the train to New York? And he said, well, if you can pay your train fare, you can come. Nice, right? So, but anyway, HIAS, which is the Jewish charity, which still exists today and helps refugees all over the world of all kinds, not just Jewish refugees, they said, well, we'll pay your fare. And so they actually landed and got off the boat in America on George Washington's birthday in 1942. Very, very cool. First president of the country. So they got here. They were free. And they got to take the train up here, which is a whole nother story, what happened on the train. But they made it. But who didn't make it? So that's the lucky part, the great part. They made it. But who didn't make it? My Uncle Lacey, my cousin Marga, for whom I am named. In Jewish tradition, I'm sure you know, people are named for a relative who died, and that's who I'm named for. as my cousin Marika, who started all of this and who is the reason, sort of in a horrible way, or indirect way, that I am alive. And 500,000 Hungarian Jews, 500,000 were killed in the last year of the war. So it wasn't the most people, Jews who died in any one country, Poland or Russia, depending on how you count, but it was the most Jews in the shortest period of time because they didn't expect it. But I also had an uncle who hid in the woods, and his wife, my aunt, had a baby during the war. And they all hid in the woods, and then they moved to France, and then they moved to America, and my cousin George is here. He became a filmmaker and a lawyer, and is very much alive and has children. And my mom, lived a very full life, married an American, and whose mother was not happy, by the way, that he was marrying an immigrant. There's just all kinds of prejudice. She got over it. So, I'm the kid, the youngest kid, and I have two older brothers. One became a lawyer, one became a jeweler. So it kind of ran in the family. And we were lucky, but so many people were not. And so we're here today to remember those who didn't make it, and those who had a tough time but did make it. And this might be, I don't know if anybody's heard this expression. You might be too young for it, but there's an expression called living well is the best revenge. Anybody hear that or know what that means? No. Yes?
I have never heard it, but I can guess what it means.
Okay, take a guess.
It probably means, like, if someone's trying to go against you, and you make it, well, I guess that's the best revenge because they don't like it, that you made it.
And that you live happily, you live a good life. You live the best life that you can is the best way to succeed against people who are miserable and nasty and don't want you to, is to be happy, be good. And that's my story. So I have time for questions. Or not. Yeah.
How long did this trip take from Hungary
To America, how long did it take? It took about 6 weeks, which seems like not such a long time, but it's a very long time when you don't know if you're going to ever get there. I was actually surprised because the way that my mother took it, would tell the story, I thought, oh, it's like 6 months. They were stuck. I mean, that's how she told it, like they were there for 6 months or a year or something. They were stuck in Portugal. I think that's how it felt. So when I learned the facts, I thought, oh, it's only 6 weeks, but 6 weeks can be forever. Yeah.
More than a month.
Yes, more than a month, and 3 weeks on the boat. A long time. Yes.
Good question. So my mom grew up in this country, and in a nice house, and then my dad too. But their parents, or my dad's parents, had more scary kind of stories, like Michelle's mom. And my question is, what was it like for you to have a mom who had had this scary kind of experience?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks. Well, I didn't know for such a long time that my mother did have this experience. I knew she was Hungarian. She had relatives who were Hungarian, and they would speak Hungarian out on the phone, or when they visited, but my father was American. And the way that we were brought up, because it was closer to the war, we were the first generation after the war, is that our parents, and my father fought in the war. He fought in World War II as an American in Europe, and they wanted us not to know any of this. They wanted us to live our lives. Living well is the best revenge. If you can't do it, your kids can. So, but when I learned about it, it explained to me my mother was a very quiet person and sad. And I didn't really understand why. We didn't really understand why. And once we knew that, it explained a little bit, but I still mostly thought, once I learned about the Holocaust, what you learn about the Holocaust is all these people died. right? They were in these terrible situations and they died. And I looked at my mom and I'm like, well, she didn't die. So big deal. I mean, honestly, this is what I thought. I'm being honest. This is what I thought as a kid. Big deal. So what? It wasn't until I grew up that I really understood trauma and how tough what she went through was. And in a way, it was tougher. This sounds awful. In a way, it was tougher for her than for, say, her best friend who had experienced worse things because she wasn't hungry during the war, because I think she felt some guilt that she didn't go through worse. And so it was painful. For a long time, I wanted to know nothing about it. And it's an irony to me that I ended up writing a book about my mother's experience, and that it's become very meaningful for me now that I'm an older adult. And my grandfather's experience becomes very real for me, because to be an older person and leave your country, it's really hard to imagine. And he did a great job. I mean, he learned English. He bought and owned a candy store, which he eventually sold to my dad. He did really well. So, long answer. Yes?
I have two questions, but have you written any other books?
Yes and no. I have written a book that is about my dad's candy store. It hasn't been published yet, but I have written it, and I'm working on some other. I've written a couple plays that were performed.
Okay. My second question is, do you know any Hungarian?
Sorry?
Do you know any Hungarian?
No, any Hungarian.
Do I? Oh, Egan, Nem, and Lavash.
What's that?
Egan is yes. No, Nem is no, and Lavash is soup.
Well, that's good to know.
And yeah, and how come I know? How come I know those words? Wait, yes and no is obvious. Lavash, because when I was a little kid, I loved soup, so that's what they taught me. But yeah, I'm sad I only know those words, but because my dad was American, he was uncomfortable hearing Hungarian.
And I have another question. Is that soup in those bottles?
No, those are candles. No, they are. So yeah.
Have you ever visited Hungary? I was thinking about it.
Well, it's also an interesting question. My brothers and I always wanted to go back to Hungary with my mom. And we planned trips a couple of times. And always she backed out. She could not face going back. And my older brother has now gone. So I've seen pictures. The apartment building where she grew up is still standing. All of that is still there, but I have not been. And probably won't go anytime soon, but yeah, maybe someday. Many of her relatives went back, but she just never wanted to. Interesting question.
I've been there 3 years ago, just
Yeah.
before COVID. And we visited, we actually took a tour of Jewish Budapest, like every step.
Interesting.
We heard the story about how they all died and how they were living like in the ghetto,
Yes.
basically in the middle of the town.
Mm-hmm.
And the story of the shoes on the,
Uh,
it was,
mm-hmm.
I can't even describe the feeling because it's, on one side, it's such a life story, and there is like, the monument that they made in the middle of the town, which is like
Mm-hmm.
so powerful. And on the other side, there's so many synagogues, and one of the biggest synagogue in Europe that is not active right now. It's like a museum, which is sad. And
Yeah.
it's like a live museum of the, Jews who once were there, but they're not there anymore. And it's like, it was very, very powerful trip.
Yeah. Oh, I imagine it would be. Yeah. Thank you.
One or two more questions, please.
Yes. Okay. You can ask.
Do you like carrots?
Do I like carrots? Yeah, why?
Because I like carrots.
Ah. I do. Do you like other vegetables too? So my mother used to make Hungarian goulash.
Yeah. When you said lavash, I was thinking that. Lavash,
Yeah.
like what? It sounds like
It sounds like
our
goulash,
languages are
right?
the same kind of
Yeah.
language.
No, but my mother didn't make a lot of Hungarian foods, but she did make goulash, and goulash has meat and carrots and some other things, but that's one of the main parts. Yeah, it's a stew, but with paprika. So, yes.
When your mom came to America, she went to Ellis Island, I believe.
Yes.
So I have some relatives who did go to Ellis Island out of the first 1,000 people to be there.
Wow.
So I'm sure they probably were on the same boat as your mom.
Well, my mother was actually on almost the last boat that came into America from Europe during the Second World War. So it might have been a different time, but similar experience. Yeah. Yes.
I was just wondering, what type of foods do you have?
What type of food do I eat?
Like the Hungarian.
Oh, the Hungarians. Right. Well, so the food is probably very similar to a lot of other Jewish, what's called Jewish food. So things like stuffed cabbage. Have you ever had, I don't know that people eat that anymore. Stuffed cabbage, stuffed peppers. So a lot of meat, but also they eat a lot of sweets, a lot of sugar. So a typical Hungarian breakfast is like a cheese Danish or a piece of cake. And it's still, I worked at one point with a young woman who was from Hungary. And so totally different generation, not Jewish. And that's what she's very thin. My mother was very thin, by the way. But she would come in and eat breakfast in the morning, and it was cake. That was just normal. So, but then I think, well, I grew up eating Frosted Flakes, which is basically worse than cake. It's all sugar. Yeah, it's all sugar. So there you go.
Frosted Flakes is literally just cornflakes but with frosting.
Yes, right, which is all sweet and sugar. It's amazing that we all have teeth still. And
Let's say thank you to Miss Bisson for sharing her mother's story with us.
thank you.
We're going to transition into our tekis. So if Maureen,
Thank you,
would
guys.
hand out the
You know what tekis is?
our tekis is ceremony or ritual.
That's a good word.
Yeah, that's a good word. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Is that, are you going early or are you are? Okay. So. So in a moment, we're going to begin our pretty short service for Yom HaShoah. But before we do, I just want to talk about some expectations for the service and get a sense from you. Someone raise your hand and tell me, what do you think? Yom HaShoah is a serious day. It's a sad day. We're remembering something very sad. So how do you think we're going to sort of conduct ourselves during this service? Someone raise your hand and tell me why you think, what would be an appropriate way. Yes, Caleb.
Like maybe more mournful.
Yeah, and what does that mean? What does that mean?
Like how you'd act if let's say somebody died and you're at their funeral.
Yeah, something like that. So we're going to be,
In this case, it's a funeral for Billy.
in this case, it's about remembering the loss of millions, which means that we're going to sort of sit sort of calmly and quietly and respectfully. Right? We're going to try to create sort of an atmosphere where we can all kind of reflect and remember for a few minutes. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. We're going to begin on page 2, and usually at the Learning Center, our Kita Zion helps lead us through this, but Kita Zion is all coincidentally not here today, unfortunately. So we're going to ask for some volunteers, maybe from Kita Vav, that can help. Would anyone like to help read the opening of our tekes? Maybe someone from Kita Vav, or someone who feels like you want to do? Could be a Madri. Teacher, you want to come up, Zach? Come on up. This is on page 2. Mm-hmm.
The whole thing?
Yeah, the whole thing.
We begin our service in the remembrance of the Holocaust in silence. Let us surround or worship our community in silence and prepare for the presence of God. Our silence is to be a community accounting for other sciences that accept persecution and were identified to crime, indifferent to crime. When will the silence end? When will we speak out on behalf of suffering neighbors? Not until we affirm God together. Not until we acknowledge that we are all God's children.
Yeshua Koach. Now we're going to sit for a few moments of silence. You can close your eyes if you want. Just sit. And another thing about Yom HaShoah is, and remembering the Holocaust is, it's a sad day, but it's also a day when we try to remember to be hopeful as well, even if it's hard. So our next reading is about hope. And I would love if another volunteer want to come. Scarlett, you want to come with me about hope?
I believe in the sun I believe in the sun even when it's not shining. I believe in the love even when there's no one there. I believe in God even when he is silent.
Yeshua. We're on page 4.
So this poet who wrote Eli Eli was Hungarian, as a matter of fact. And Tana Senesh was from Hungary. Wow. Well, my knowledge, maybe. I don't know. Oh. So, and also rescued a lot of Jews, a lot of Hungarian Jews as well, who got to be deported. So she wrote beautiful poetry. Can we just read together? Let's read the English of the translation. We read it all together. It says, "O God, my God." Are you ready? O God,
my God, I pray that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the lightning of heavens, the prayer of
mankind. Right. In Hebrew, Eli, Eli, Shelo Yigamer Le'olam, Hachol V'Hayam, Rish Rush Shel Hamayim, Barak Hashamayim, Tefilat Ha'adam. And her poetry was put to music. She wrote some beautiful poetry. And I'll sing it for you. But
candles, which is a very traditional thing that Jews all over the world do on Yom HaShoah, and that we also do when people die. Would someone like to come up and read our Kavanah for that? Page 5.
We are the children of this generation filled with God's light. We now light 6 candles in memory of the 6 million Jews whose lives were extinguished during the Holocaust. As we light these candles, we commit ourselves to build a world that has no room for hatred, no place for violence. Together we pray for the strength to fulfill this promise. Should I go?
So our first candle, how about a teacher maybe for this one? Maura Linda, would you light our first candle for us?
Even though you did Madrich or Madricha,
Well, we don't have any Madrichim in here.
I'll represent.
You gotta represent, yeah. No, I guess from right to left. Yeah.
There we go. In memory of children and teenagers who were cut down before their time.
The next thing is we're going to include a prayer called El Male Rachamim, which is on page 9. Has anyone ever heard this prayer before? Has anyone ever been to a Jewish funeral? If you've been to a Jewish funeral, you've probably heard this prayer before. It's a very traditional Jewish prayer that asks for something very mysterious, and I'm curious if anyone can help me understand what it means. At the end, we ask the people who died that they are bound up in the bonds of life. What do you think that means? Do you have any ideas? It's a very mysterious phrase. Yeah, Simon. Could mean that. Could mean that. Other ideas?
Maybe that like they keep reliving a life in a way.
Ooh, that they keep reliving life in a way. It could mean that. Yeah, it could mean that. That's interesting. Like being reborn, it could mean that. Some Jews do believe that people are born again after they die. Reincarnation is a Jewish idea too. It's very interesting. It could mean that. Yeah. Any other ideas? Could mean the people who are still alive keep talking about them and telling their stories and coming together to light candles and remember. Any other ideas? Okay, well, it sounds like this. It's on page 9. El male rachamim shochen b'meromim Hamtzei menucha nechona tachat kanfei hashchina b'malot kedoshim utorim kezohar arakia mazirim ed nishmot kol acheinu b'nei Yisrael shenitbechu b'shoah anashim nashim v'tav shenechneku v'shenisrefu v'shenergu shemasru et nafsham al kiddush Hashem B'Gan Eden tehei menuchatam Ana bala rachamim Hastirem b'seter kinafecha leolamim Utzra b'tzor achayim Et nishmoteim Adonai unachalatam V'yanuchu b'shalom al mishkevoteim V'nomar Amen. We can read together on page 9 in English. Exalted, compassionate God, grant perfect peace in your sheltering presence among the holy and the pure, to the souls of all our brethren, men, women, and children of the house of Israel, who were slaughtered and suffocated and burned to ashes. May their memory endure, inspiring truth and loyalty in our lives. May their souls thus be bound up in the bond of life. May they rest in peace, and let us say, Amen. And we're going to conclude on pages 10 and 11 with two songs that are really both in some ways about hope and about keeping hope going. So maybe we'll start with keeping hope alive. So maybe we'll start with the Star Spangled Banner and finish with Hatikva, and so our anthem and Israel's anthem. And I'll ask everyone to please stand up for these. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night when our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner are yet wave, o'er the land of the free, and the home of the
What does Hatifa mean, by the way? What's the word Hatifa? Right there. The hope. The hope, exactly.
hope.
What a beautiful way to conclude our
Lord, Baleba Benima, Nefesh Yehudi Omiyah, Ulfate Mizrach Adima, Hayin Letzion Sophia. Hod love the tikvateinu, ha-tikva v'shnot alpayim, liyotam chofshi be'artzeinu, Eretz Zion b'Yerushalayim, liyotam chofshi be'artzeinu, Eretz Zion Yerushalayim. Thank you to all of you for lighting candles and for reading and for participating so respectfully in our tekes for Yom HaShoah, our Yom HaShoah ritual here at the Learning Center. We did something that Jews all around the world are doing today, trying to remember something that was sad, but also trying to hope that we can continue to build a better world together, and that depends on all of you. So thank you for starting that today.
the next generation.
We have about 5 more minutes. I think there's a little bit of Kabbalah Shabbat going on in the over in the library, so we can in a few minutes we can go get some juice, and we'll have dismissal as usual. Oh, one more thing. Actually, everyone have a seat. So we have a present for our storyteller and our speaker on behalf of all of the students here at the Learning Center, on behalf of the PJC, telling stories, as maybe you know about your rabbi at this point, is something I think is so important. And stories grow, right? And they flower, and they make the world a little bit more beautiful. And we're so thankful to Miss Bisson for sharing her mother's story with us. And may it, like this one flower, may it continue to bear fruit and to make the world a little more beautiful and a little bit more kind. And kol hakavod for sharing that with us. So thank you so much. Okay. Thank you all so much for coming. Just a reminder, this weekend, moving from Yom HaShoah to Yom HaAtzmaut, which is Israel's birthday. We're starting that celebration here at the Learning Center this weekend. We're having an amazing a cappella group here throughout the weekend, Friday night and Saturday morning. And then at my house on Saturday night, we're going to have a bonfire and toast marshmallows and have some pizza and some singing. So, in all, starting Israel's birthday. So please come and tell your parents to join us for that. And there's a trip to Israel coming up next year. So also tell your parents, hey, I want to go to Israel with the PJC. Right? It's going to be awesome. Okay. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I think we can. I think if there, let's go do the right paragraph and vote with Kabbalah Shabbat. We're
she often doesn't care. She's the strangest cat in the history of, she's the most wonderful but strangest cat. She does not like things most cats like, so she probably doesn't care. Again, I doubt she'll go anywhere near it.
dla mnie miska działa, patrz.
No pokaż. No.
No ja wczoraj szłem spać i działała.
No to nie wiem.
No miska działa.
Dla niego nie działa.
To mnie to nie interesuje, on nic
On
nie
jest misiek wiesz, chaotyczny, ja myślę, to jest
Tak.
on musi się musi to trzeba powiedzieć. Dla wszystkich działa, dla niego nic nie działa. Zatem misiek, gdzie musieli iść na szybę, a tam matka umarła, tak, wiesz, 90 lat.
No, ona była miska, co z nią było już tak wiesz.
W każdym razie, wiesz, trzeba będzie się pojawić ładna. To nie wiem kiedy, zastanawiam się, kiedy będzie na innej wizji.
A kiedy zmarł? Wczoraj?
Dzisiaj, no.
No, to może miska
Od niedzieli się zaczyna szliwa. Także nie wiem,
poniedziałek.
wiesz, żeby nie było nic. Dobra, idę coś zjeść.
A nie wiem, co
Jadłeś,
poniedziała, ale działa.
Nie wiem,
A
co mam
okej.
napisać?
O,
Co
masz
mamy
napisać.
napisać? It works for me?
A do kogo on to napisał?
Moje CV napisałam, no nie widziałeś?
Tak. Ja w ogóle.
Co?
Ale do kogo on to napisał? Nie możemy
Do
tego
ciebie i to ja nie dochodzę, mam teraz zobacz. Już nie mam telefonu. Nie, to tak wiesz. Zobacz. Jest do Anki, do Rusznika i do ciebie.
On napisał?
Tak. Dana, I'm not sure this is exactly a house issue, but we've been unable to make the projector in the sanctuary work. We've tried several computers. Anyway,
Ja nie wiem, w czym oni mają problem.
but the AGN cable doesn't seem to be picking up the screens. Could be, czyli na co ja mam napisać?
Dzisiaj ja nie wiem, czy komputer pracuje, projektor pracuje. Miśka, może trzeba przełączyć na jeden, może trzeba przełączyć na dwa, bo to przełącza, zobacz. Widzisz? Computer 2, no
O to
signal.
chodziło, że tak.
Computer 1.
Aha.
Miśka, to jest ten. Pokaż. To zaraz zobaczysz. Oni są, kurwa. Im nie pracuje, kurwa. Wszystkim pracuje, tylko jemu nie pracuje. Jak potrzebują babysitter, to kurwa mać nie zadzwonią po babysitter. Ja wczoraj im podłączyłem specjalnie, kurwa. Nie ten, tylko
The
ten.
HDMI cable doesn't seem to be picking up the screens. It could be loose cable up in the projector. Adam, could you please give it a look after this evening?
Ja nie wiem, co on ma za problem. Ja nie wiem, jaki jest Amplitude czy scena. Zaraz zobaczymy. Komputer. Ja nie mogę tego otworzyć. Zobacz, jak kogoś potrzebują od godziny 4 do 6, to nie płacą. Ja nie będę przecież stał, kurwa, czy to działa, czy to nie działa.
Ale nie jest świetne. Wszystkie produkty sprzątają. I sufit napraw, i pomaluj, kurwa mać komputer ten, i
Dlatego
projekt
mówię,
ten,
Miśka, mnie to dla mnie działa. Jeżeli ktoś nie umie podłączyć, Miśka, to już jest ich problem. Ja im nie poradzę.
No ja nie wiem, jest napisane no sygnał, no to ja nie wiem.
Zobacz, czy jest sygnał, czy Miśka, ja nie mogę go otworzyć. Dla mnie projektor działa.
Anka kiedy wraca?
Nie mam pojęcia.
Dobra, idę zjeść. Czy ty jadłeś, tak?
Nie, jest ładnie.
Czy ty nie będziesz jadł?
Możesz mu napisać, for me projector working. Or last night working